The first contributor is Professor John Maynard, to my right. He's a Warramai man who's established a reputation as a leading Indigenous historian in Australia. He's written on soccer and horse racing, on Aboriginal participation in World War I, and the parallels between Indigenous Australians and Native Americans. And he wrote for us about newspaper proprietor J.J. Maloney and his promotion of the status of Aboriginal people by helping Indigenous people to speak up for themselves in the 1920s and 30s. And we'll talk about Maloney today.
Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to share the stage with Vera, I have to say. I mean, I've had the pleasure of interviewing Vera in the past for the long play, I have to tell you. And that was a very rewarding experience because Vera's memories are so rich, also imparting to me personally those experiences of living in depression camps with Aboriginal neighbours in regards to some of those memories that she shared. So she's a great walking and talking, if you like, archive for us here in Newcastle. I also want to acknowledge Nancy and James and Eric for pulling this book together. I know what's involved in being an editor of a book, and I think they've done an outstanding job. I know with the chapter that I did and on John J. Maloney, I wrote actually 10,000 words when there's 3,000 words a limit. I'll have to do more with that in the future, but of a guy who certainly deserves a bigger picture. I also want to acknowledge Joe Tregellis, who's in the audience here, and J.J. Maloney, who I feature on the chapter here. Joe is J.J. Maloney's granddaughter, and I certainly thank Joe for the letters and the photographs that and help she provided me with for in putting this particular story together. J.J. Maloney, when you look back at it, is just such a champion, a courageous man, fighter, campaigner for the underdog in history of this city, and for basically was forgotten in regards to what he did and what he stood for. He was a fierce nationalist. He was a conservationist, an environmentalist, and a supporter and campaigner for Aboriginal people and issues long before any of those names even took place, people standing up in regards to that. For me as well, I think writing this particular chapter is something that I've felt is important for a long time. Certainly I've written a lot of stuff about Aboriginal political activism, particularly in connection with my grandfather, and the rise of early Aboriginal political activism 90 years ago, and the importance of recognising those non-Indigenous people who were brave enough and courageous enough to stand up alongside Aboriginal people and fight for issues. And then we know certainly from the 60s, Charlie Perkins and the Freedom Ride, we've had the celebration of the Freedom Ride only recently. The Gurindji walk-off at Wave Hill, I should say that the Freedom Ride with Charlie Perkins, of course, there's Charlie and a whole bunch of non-Indigenous students on that bus from the University of Sydney who exposed the shocking living conditions of Aboriginal people in the state. The Gurindji walk-off at Wave Hill in 66, a lot of trade union support, a lot of, for the time, as a white media support. The 67 referendum with 92% of the population supporting Aboriginal people on issues. The 72 candidacy, Gary Foley and people like that will tell you there were a lot of non-Indigenous students and supporters as part of that very, very famous moment in Aboriginal political history. Now for J.J. Maloney, and again I acknowledge Joe and some of those letters, and I'll just read a few of the parts of the chapter. And he wrote to his daughter Agnes in 1924, and he offered her words of encouragement. And he said, "Kintakora is the Aboriginal slogan for fear not. So keep this musical phrase in your memory and have no fears of anything. Kintakora has been my motto, and by musing on it, I have arrived at that stage where I fear no one. And I want you to cultivate that same spirit of fearlessness, but never minus respectfulness. Be good, be kind, be true, be brave, fearless and happy, but also be careful." I think that opening sentence sums up who J.J. Maloney was. He was born at Menangle, southwest of Sydney in 1866, and he came to Newcastle in 1903, and he worked for David Cohen and Company, Co Limited here. He was very instrumental in setting up the New South Wales Swimming Organisation, the Surf Lifesaving Clubs. He actually managed the first Australian international swimming team to tour overseas that went to New Zealand. He was the manager of that team. So here in Newcastle, when he arrived, he was instrumental in setting up the Newcastle Surf Club. He was involved with the United Charities Day organisation. He was president of the Newcastle RSPCA, vice president of the Newcastle Historical Society, the vice consul for Greece, secretary of the Australian Society of Patriots, trustee of the Longworth Institute, and a member of the Newcastle Hospital Board, just to give you some idea of this guy's commitment to the local community. But certainly, he also involved with setting up Bullbar Island out in Lake Macquarie as an environmental sanctuary, particularly with flora, native plants, bushes, and bringing in animals, as I said, to be kept on the island, which sadly for Maloney's ideals continued to be slaughtered by people who came out to the island and killed all the animals that him and the other people who were working with him set up on the island. But the most important thing for me, of course, was his stance of fighting for Aboriginal people. And I'll give how much longer I've got?
You have about 4 minutes.
All right, a couple of points in regards to that. He changed, which is an important part to say. I mean, he carried from a young life this picture of Aboriginal people as the noble savage, and he certainly wrote earlier on in that sort of vent, and as he went along he changed. But nevertheless, early on he said, the treatment of the native people of Australia is a black blot on our national history. The defamation of the Aboriginals is in a large measure traceable to the lessons contained in the school books. He was a great one for Australian history, not British history. He said there's got to be a new tack on this. We've got to look at the history of this place. Of the lessons contained in the school books, which were imported for use in the Australian schools more than 2 generations ago. If the books for use in Australian schools had been written in Australia by Australians at the dawn of our education system, things might have been different today. By the mid-1920s, he had a connection with Aboriginal activists like my grandfather, Tom Lacey, Sid Ridgway, also a non-Indigenous woman, Elizabeth Mackenzie Hatton, who I've wrote about previously, another champion of Aboriginal rights. And he's writing even more powerfully by the mid-1920s through that connection to Aboriginal activists. And he says, the inequity of the position maddens me. To see these poor creatures kicked into the bush worse than dogs. Aboriginal people have been thrown off their land at this particular point, in the early decades of the 20th century. Their homes built by their own hands confiscated, no compensation, no redress. Their children kidnapped by the Crown and sent to work for Collins Whites at 6p a week, robbed at every turn, derided by all parties, every church equally to blame, priests, bishops, parsons, all equally guilty. And again, it was his daughter, Dorothy, was also instrumental with him in the Newcastle newspaper, The Voice of the North. It was the title of basically the chapter, John J. Maloney, The Voice of the North. And Dorothy was also followed her father's trench and a great campaigner, and I'll probably finish off with this particular quote. And Dorothy was writing about the shocking conditions of Aboriginal people that had been portrayed in the newspaper at the time in Western Australia. And she says, the camera cannot lie, and now Australia must be ranked with the Congo and Sudan in its treatments of human beings. I was also under the impression that there were Christians in Western Australia, but possibly I am wrong again. Yet I cannot remember a single utterance by any Christian regarding their barbarous treatment of the rural owners of this country. I never dreamed that the Southern Cross, which floated proudly on the peninsula of Gallipoli, would wave over conditions as delineated in that gruesome picture. There was a picture, as I said, of Aboriginal people in chains in Western Australia. But I'll finish on that note. But as I said, thanks to everybody who put this book together, and I really want to pay my respects to this champion, courageous man, John J. Maloney. Thank you.